launcher is and has been one of the anti-tank RPG grenade launcher is and has been one of the most common and effective infantry weapons in past and current conflicts. One of the favorites of certain armies and rebel groups and terror groups. You have probably already seen it in the news, movies, and video games. Its use and destruction that it can cause. However, the reason why it continues to be used in such an evolved time is that the RPG and its various variants are still very lethal, very cheap to produce, and very easy to use. Think of it this way: a tank or armored vehicle worth several $1,000,000 can be destroyed with a projectile of less than $500. That is something impressive. In this video, I tried to show you in a concrete way with examples that this weapon can be lethal against a human, a vehicle with and without armor, and even against tanks and helicopters. So not to use so many Hollywood myths or anything like that, but the complete truth of the power of this legendary weapon. Well, let's start with a little history. The basic design of the RPG was developed by the Soviets shortly after World War II in the form of RPG-2. It is believed that during World War II, the Soviets were impressed by the performance and power of destructive weapons such as the German panzerfaust and the American bazooka. Later, in 1961, the RPG-2 was replaced by the RPG-7, and this was supplied to the Soviet Army and deployed at platoon level. Thereafter, nearly 9 million RPG-7 launchers and its variants have proliferated throughout the world and on the continents. Although there are many Russian, Bulgarian, Chinese, Iranian, Iraqi, Romanian, and Pakistani manufacturing units, and many of them produced locally, the RPG-7 is usually cataloged as a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. From there derives the name RPG itself. The RPG-7 is particularly the most commercialized and well-known RPG platform in the world. It is 37 inches and weighs 14 pounds unloaded. In addition, it has a rate of fire of 46 rounds per minute. When an RPG is fired and leaves the barrel at 103 meters per second in the flight, the rocket deploys stabilizing fins while the projectile rotates towards the target. The conical shape of the RPG forms a jet of explosive energy towards the outside. When the projectile reaches its objective, from there, the penetration power of the weapon and the armor is derived. But before I start to say how lethal an RPG can be, two things should be clarified in the first place. There are multiple variants of the RPG. For example, the Soviets used 3 reusable launchers: RPG-2, RPG-7, and RPG-16. Although today, there are more modern variants such as RPG-29 or ER Chronic PSR E1. It is also important to make it clear that the effects of an RPG depend on the projectile. Overpressure from the blast probably wouldn't kill you, except perhaps the thermo-ovarian version, which from a distance of 10 meters would be particularly lethal. If it hits someone in the chest and detonates, it is safe to say that all of its parts would be scattered. If it hits a limb, the pieces of the limb would be scattered everywhere. But even at such a short distance, that is 10 meters, the rest of his body could survive the explosion. You should know that the RPGs do not really carry a large amount of explosives. Almost all of them have less than 1 pound in addition. The body of the initial victim would absorb a large part of the energy of the explosion, so that his companions would surely only be stunned and slightly injured from their ears if they are unprotected, but they can still survive. Still, fragmentation pieces of metal would be thrown in all directions, as it would be with a fragmentation grenade, and it is basically a large grenade with a propellant bar that fires it forward like a shovel. The lethal radius of the fragmentation warhead is about 7 meters. That does not mean that all people within the radius of 7 meters are guaranteed to lose their lives, but the chances are not very favorable. At such a short distance, and if fragmentation occurs at about 100 to 150 meters, it is still lethal, but it is not so likely that it will reach you due to the dispersion. In any case, there is the possibility of secondary fragmentation, fragments that do not come directly from the RPG In this case, the closest thing to secondary fragmentation would be pieces of bone from the victim being pushed out or scattered rocks. This would not be as dangerous as the primary although the bone would probably break, but still considered that it would not have the necessary resistance to explode. On the other hand, the size, the shape, and the speed of the projectile do not allow it to completely penetrate a person, so most likely it would jam, and rocket getting jammed on humans is not a myth. At some point in 2013 in Afghanistan, an American soldier was directly hit by an RPG-7 rocket. The projectile hit and launched in the soldier's hip without detonating it. Although with caution, he was taken to an advanced surgical base where the medics and technicians worked to save his life and extract the projectile in the end. They succeeded and the warhead was extracted. However, this is not the only case, since there have been multiple cases where an RPG got stuck in the abdomen or leg of a soldier and did not detonate. One thing is that it's hardly discussed is the improper storage and edge or improper use of the weapon. It can and does cause such. Weapons not to detonate as they were designed. Now, well, that would be the result of using an RPG to destroy a vehicle without and with good armor. The answer cannot be generalized. This depends entirely on the type of warhead that is used. The warhead, known as HEAT by its acronym, translated High Projectile Anti-Tank Explosive Power, can penetrate up to 29 inches of conventional armor and 19 inches of reactive armor. Taking this into account, that is fired on the flat terrain, although it usually only manages to penetrate 11 inches of conventional armor. So taking this into account, these parameters, it is clear that attacking an unarmored vehicle with the HEAT warhead would kill all occupants of the vehicle and render the vehicle completely unusable. According to the accounts, the Nigerian dictator Anastasio Somoza Debayle was killed with multiple shots from M16 rifles and finished with an RPG-2 projectile. The vehicle, the dictator Somoza ended up with the entire roof destroyed, as you are seeing in this image. An armored vehicle of the level 4 or 5 of the NJ certification used in cars of diplomats and military tactical vehicles could possibly cushion part of the power of RPG, although surely they would not come out untouched. Any vehicle with an armor less than level 4 would undoubtedly be smashed by a short-range RPG projectile, but things get more interesting when we talk about the effect of an RPG on the tank, because in fact the main purpose of an RPG at the time of its development, it was destroying tanks. And again, we must remember that it cannot be generalized that they are lethal, because it depends on the thickness of the tank's armor and the RPG projectile that is used. Although here I have an accurate picture, to be able to destroy a modern tank with the greater effectiveness, the impact would have to be at a short distance. We are talking about 50 to 100 meters maximum, and should impact the weakest area of the tank, which is usually the roof and rear, where the chassis or turret is located. Therefore, RPGs are more effective in urban battlefields, where they can be located behind or above a tank and shooting at close range to its weak points. The U.S. Army faced this problem during the Iraq War, and to counteract it, it developed the Urban Survival Kit for tanks and equipment, and some of its M1 and A2 tanks. This kit adds reactive armor on the sides and a cage-shaped armor at the rear to protect against RPGs. But even with many of these advantages, it all depends on the possibilities. For example, in Iraq, several Abrams tanks were penetrated and destroyed by shots from the sides and rear From the same war, Abrams received between 14 to 18 hits from its RPG-7 and continued to operate without problems. On the other hand, the T-90, a Russian tank, the third generation, has an armor thickness of 25 to 33 inches on the front, while on the side it has 19 to 27 inches. This means that a T-90 is particularly unvulnerable from the front of an RPG-7, but could be penetrated from the side and rear. However, despite having advanced reactive armor, also has the STORA infrared ATM interference system that would cancel an RPG-7 if it were detected. So we're talking about a modern tank. If we're talking about a modern tank with reactive armor and active or passive protection measures, it would be almost impossible for an RPG to destroy it. When we talk about tanks with inferior and low armor, the chances of destroying them are quite high, and even more when it's short distance. Now, well, although the RPG was not originally designed to destroy helicopters, it can do it. It should be noted that the RPG-7 is a direct firearm, that is, in its effectiveness on the battlefield is directly affected by the ability of the shooter. The RPG does not have any type of guide rocket. Where you aim is where the rocket goes. The greatest weakness of the weapon is the crosswind, when it is aimed at a target at a distance with winds greater than 7 miles per hour. A shooter cannot expect to hit more than 50% of the time. Beyond 180 meters, we must also calculate both the direction and the speed of the wind, but even then the results can vary a lot. The most widely publicized and famous case of an RPG shooting down an aircraft is the downing of two UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters in Mogadishu, Somalia, in October 1994, a myth that inspired one of the most iconic war films of all time, Black Hawk Down. The RPG was designed to destroy moving tanks at a maximum speed of 49 miles per hour, but most aircraft soldiers fly double or triple that speed, so multiple RPGs must be shot at the same time to increase the probability of shooting down a helicopter. During the Vietnam War, RPGs both in dispersion RPG-2 and RPG-7 were responsible for downing of 128 U.S. helicopters. Meanwhile, the Mujahideen shot down Soviet helicopters with RPGs in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen discovered that the best tactic against helicopters was ambushes, so they placed machine guns and RPGs around the landing zone. When the helicopter landed, massive fire from RPGs and our machine guns pounced on the aircraft, which was completely disabled along with its crew members. Also, the Mujahideen found that a frontal shot at a helicopter at a distance of 100 meters was optimal to make it fall in motion. The Association of Aerospace Industries reports that 40% of the aircraft shot down in Operation Enduring Freedom in Iraq were due to RPG and another 20% to small arms fire. The challenge of RPG countermeasures is complicated by the typical short range with little reaction time. Let me give you a very clear example. The ranges of a guided missile can exceed 3 miles, but they will only take about 3 seconds to hit a helicopter. That gives the pilot time too early to listen to the rocket being launched from the rooftop. 40 meters away, an RPG that is not guided by infrared will hit in 250 milliseconds, and without the pilot receiving an alert on average, the human eye takes between 300 and 400,000 milliseconds to complete a blink. It is almost impossible at a close range for a helicopter to dodge an RPG projectile. The distance from the helicopter to the combat zone is quite crucial to define whether to shoot them down. Zone is quite crucial to define where to shoot them down already or not, because you have to be clear about a helicopter moving at more than 62 miles per hour and at a distance of 900 meters or more. It is almost impossible for one or more RPG projectiles to hit it. It should also be clarified that there are helicopters that have armor, such as the AH-64 Apache, of which we have record has supported shots of 50 calibers and 20mm ammunition, and also RPGs. The Apache is if it could withstand an RPG attack in certain parts, as it has already done, although we must emphasize that it depends a lot where the impact is. Usually the tail rotor is usually the part of the helicopter. No matter how armored it will still go down. In short, the RPG-7 is here to stay for many more years. As we said at the beginning, its price compared to the damage it could do to $1 million vehicles is by far a great bet. It has been everything. I hope you enjoyed it. If If you want to know about another weapon or military vehicle, subscribe and activate that powerful notification bell.